trying to do is give poor people security over home ownership. But the fundamental flaw they've made is that when people own a house, they're not going to borrow more. What we say on this side of the house is what they do is they incentivize people who own their houses to take out mortgages. They incentivize people who own houses to become new victims of the subprime crisis. And what we're going to show you is why, firstly, the aim of government to provide security is destroyed by their policy. Secondly, why the people that they're targeting cannot sustain private home ownership because they do not have the independent sources of income alternate to the capital invested in the home. Likely to become victims of this. But first, some points of rebuttal. I honestly do not know what was going on in Extension over there. And I don't think anyone else in the room does. But there's two things that I can identify. The first thing that he said is that when you own one house, you can buy more. I think in parts this was supposed to be something to do with how if you give people capital then they can improve themselves and they can buy more homes and the like. No. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that you need more than the house itself in order to borrow more money in the way that they want you to invest in lots of other houses. To invest in other houses, you need enough money that you can rent another house yourself or own another house yourself to live in so that you can then go and rent these other houses. We don't think this applies to the poor homeless people that they're talking about. Secondly, they said, well, the problem is that we destroy balanced communities. We don't really understand. Firstly, we say that you can have social cohesion in areas where people don't own their houses. We have societies like mining communities in the north of England where people have long-term stable places to stay, where they do not own their homes, where they build up stable communities and large levels of social capital. He said, well, then what we're going to be able to do if people own their houses is they can move around more. They can sell their houses when property becomes expensive. We think that the only way that this is going to happen to poor people is they're going to be forced excessively down market. If it is the case that they think that they can get a benefit from their house at this point in time, sell their house and move on, we don't think they're going to be able to sell their house and buy a better house. They're going to sell their house and move into increasingly inferior quality of housing space. No, thank you. Then finally, what we think on their point is that property speculation can only happen and affect you in a system where you own your house. If the state owns your house and your housing is secure in the long term, and the state is the person that guarantees your housing no matter what, you cannot be a victim of property speculation because your housing is secure. They take away that guarantee. They say that what they're doing is they're providing both for people who want to live in public housing and people who don't. But no, they're not, because they do have a limited stock of capital. They do have a limited stock of public finance. They're reallocating finance away from poor people to mortgage lenders. But one other thing that I wanted to deal with that came up in the beginning of the debate is this idea that somehow the way we sustain this, and this is one of my first points about limited funding, is by taxing the rich into the ground to keep capitalism alive. Now, we think this is crazy for two reasons. Firstly, because they're removing capital from the people who are best placed to use it. The people that are best placed to use the vast amounts of capital are those who can make big investment decisions, who can solve collective action problems, who can allocate investment on the basis of increased education and knowledge into industries which help the poor in the long term. They take that money away from those people. But secondly, because government loses control over those funds forever. When a government buys a public house or builds a public house, it is then able to be responsive to changing needs in society. It can reallocate that house from someone who no longer needs that house to someone who really does, someone that is homeless. We cannot do that when we don't own the house as the state anymore. Now some private guy who doesn't need it anymore owns the house. What our job should be is to give people a boost, to give them a help in the short term. They don't do that. They lock the house the money into these particular individuals. But secondly, these individuals are unable to sustain ownership. Yes, Jay.
Why don't we give people a boost in the long term and improve communities?
Because we're not giving them a boost in the long term for these reasons. Firstly, we've seen in the United Kingdom that these individuals are unable to pay for the upkeep of their houses. They're unable to pay the rates that are necessary to be paid for these houses. They're unable to pay the utility bills, which are often disconnected from these individuals. You see old people who live in communities which have died and have been destroyed. They cannot move if they own the house because all of the capital, their life savings, is invested in that house. The only way they move is by selling it, but no one will buy it because they live in an area that is being destroyed or that is problematic. They say they're at the risk of dodgy landlords if they don't own it. The landlord in your model is the state when it's public ownership. Our landlord in the West is the state. They're not going to kick out the homeless and the very poor from these individuals. We think that's rubbish. But we also think that these individuals, as the Thatcherite model showed, where increased home ownership has led to 4 times the level of homelessness that existed before privatisation of ownership, is that these individuals do tend to take out mortgages. And they tend to take out unsustainable debt burdens. They told us that prices of houses will always rise, so you're always going to get a continued investment. Well, I don't know where you've been for the past few years, ladies and gentlemen, but it's just not true. They don't. And no, thank you. What you also then do is you lock these people into wage slavery in a more extreme way, because they have to have more and more jobs just to keep up the home that they own, just to sustain the lifestyle that they've become accustomed to that you've created, which they cannot sustain because house prices don't rise dramatically all the time. Finally, they fetishize ownership. They create a culture like exists in Britain, where they say a man's home is his castle, where the thing that matters is owning a house, where the thing that matters is owning a commodity. So people put all of their investment, all of their funds into this massive attempt to keep up with the Joneses, or to keep up with the societal norm. It says that you have to own a house just to be a member of the society that they can look in the face. I don't have less respect for Shengwu because he's a renter. I have less respect for Shengwu because he ran this case. That when you tell poor people and you tell people at the margins of society that instead of investing in education, instead of investing in food for their children, instead of investing in clothing and sustaining the needs that they really do have in the short term, instead of buying the refrigerator for your business, what should you do? You should spend all of that money on a house which you can't afford to sustain in the long term, where you may have to mortgage it and then become susceptible to these loan sharks, and where you have no absolute guarantee that for the rest of your life you will have somewhere to live. They remove that from the homeless and the most poor, and we have to oppose this crazy notion.